Hello and welcome, and this is Peter. The first thing I want to do is say thank you very much for listening to this audio. I really appreciate you, so thank you for listening. The topic of this audio is how did I help the richest man in Australia pull off one of the biggest corporate turnarounds ever? Okay? How did I help the richest man in Australia pull off one of the biggest corporate turnarounds ever? Now that's a mighty big claim. That's a mighty big claim because Kerry Packer, for those of you who don't know, James Packer is Kerry Packer's son. Some of you may know James Packer because he's quite famous around the world. So Kerry Packer was the richest man in Australia after Rupert Murdoch left. Okay, and most people know the name Rupert Murdoch associated with Fox. So Kerry Packer could obviously hire anyone he damn well chose to hire. Because he had the most money of any man in the country. So he can hire anyone to solve his business problems, right? So that's the first thing to know. Now, the business that I'm talking about, it was called Australian Consolidated Press. It was the #1 magazine publisher in Australia. So Kerry Packer had a TV station, and he had magazine publishing. And in Australia at the time, you couldn't own a newspaper and a TV station because of the level of influence that you could bring to it as editor. So the newspaper business had to be owned separately to TV business, and Murdoch owned newspapers in Australia, and Packer owned TV and magazines. So, Packer, a lot of money in those days in the 80s, 70s and 80s, a lot of money in TV advertising, a lot of money in newspaper advertising. So Packer was a big player in the country. So his magazine business did very well, and he had the biggest titles in the country. But in 1996-97 period, we all know what happened. A thing called the internet happened, and people started building websites and publishing information and then putting ads next to that information. Okay? So the internet started draining money from magazine sales. Now, of course, early on it wasn't very much money, and Packer saw this coming, so Packer did a deal with Bill Gates to own 51% of Microsoft Online, the MSN network in Australia. But even owning 51% of MSN wasn't enough to halt the decline of his magazine business. And over the following years, 97, 98, 99, things were pretty tough. Things were pretty tough. So, I think it was 96, late 96, early 97 was the first time I spoke to ACP, and they wanted a data warehouse to help understand their business to see if they could stop this drain which was beginning to become evident by then. And we tried to sell them a deal. They said no. What they did first off was they got one of their internal IT people to try building this data warehouse for them. And then the next time I talked to them, I was with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and we did a short 1-week study for them and gave them a proposal for a data warehouse from PricewaterhouseCoopers with the obvious price tag of a PricewaterhouseCoopers project. And they said, no, we want to go with an individual consultant, a buddy of mine who wasn't good enough for the job, but they went with him anyway because they figured that's cheaper, right? Certainly it would be a lot cheaper than hiring us at PricewaterhouseCoopers. We did have a fairly eye-watering price for the project. That's what we do at PricewaterhouseCoopers, right? So they said no again. And then the third time, I was now over at Ardent Software. So this is my third company trying to make the deal with the same customer. And they said, no, our vendor has told us that they're building a data warehouse and they're going to deliver us a data warehouse associated with the vendor product. I said, okay, that's fine. And they tried that, and that failed. And so we were back for the fourth time, and I'm like, I'm talking to the same people, and it's the fourth time, and I'm like, how are you going? And they're like, Pete, we are out of ideas. I mean, you know the history. You've been here for 3 years trying to sell us this thing. Said, you know the history. We're done. We're out of ideas. And, we're business has gone very bad over the last 3 years. I said, yeah, I've seen the numbers. And so we're competing for this deal the fourth time. And a guy called Andrew Robb put his oar in the water, and he was the president of the Conservative political party. So we had to go fight him to get the deal. And finally, him and a company that he wanted to get the deal. So finally, the fourth time around, we get this deal. And it got delayed by 3 months in the fight with this guy, Andrew Robb, over the deal. So numbers were so bad. By then, we're now talking Easter 2000, right? And it was so bad, things were so bad, that at the annual general meeting, Kerry Packer called his company, ACP, a dog with fleas. He'd entrusted it to James to run. He called it a dog with fleas, and James had brought in one of his buddies to help him run the company. Kerry fired the managing director and installed his own guy, a guy called John Alexander, who I know quite well. So right before we arrived, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks before we arrived, Kerry has had enough, and he fires the managing director and puts John Alexander in there. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this place is in turmoil, and the business results were terrible. And they had 37% market share. I remember the day that I started, they had 37% market share. So anyhow, I go for a meeting with John Alexander, the new managing director. Like first week, one of the first things to do is go talk to the boss. I go to this meeting and he says, Pete, I sure hope you got something because we got nothing. And I went, really? He said, yep, you know the story, because obviously he knew I'd been around. And I've been here for a couple of weeks. I've talked to everybody. Between us, we don't have an idea. And I'm like, really? He says, we are done. We don't have any idea how to turn this ship around. He said, in fact, I feel like I've been handed a poison chalice. And I'm like, okay, well, give us a chance to look into this thing. And, I'm sure that we can help in some way, shape or form. And he's like, I sure hope you can. That's where we're at. So we're coming into a business. I was coming into a magazine publishing business I had never done before, ever. Like, these are the biggest magazine publishing business in the country. What other magazine publishing business am I going to do, right? And I'm talking to the managing director who tells me he's spoken to all the senior staff and they got nothing. That was what I came into at ACP, right? So we're doing our first business requirement session, right? It's about 15 people there, all the senior editors, etc. And the mood was not very good. The mood was not very good at all. And I said, I'm here to help. I don't know much about your business, but, we're here to help you turn it around. That's what we're here to do. We do business consulting. Yeah, there's a technology component, but we do business consulting. And I couldn't tell them about the National Australia Bank because of the non-disclosure agreements. And I said, just trust me, I have helped household name companies in this country make a lot more money. And I think that I can help you too, right? So let's see how we go. And I was pretty upbeat. And during the conversation, we had like this 2-hour discussion. It might have been even 3 hours. It was a long discussion because people were kind of down and I was kind of up. So they were happy to see somebody who had some optimism, yeah? So anyhow, during this conversation, this woman puts up a hand to make a comment, and I say, yeah. And she says, Peter, do you understand that we don't sell the same product each week? And I went, no, I don't understand that. And I smiled at her and said, look, I'm married. I have 2 daughters, but I don't read your magazines mostly because they're women's magazines. Most of your magazines are women's magazines. And they go, well, yeah. I said, and my wife reads your magazine. She loves them. Okay. But just presume I don't understand your business at all. Explain it to me like I have no idea. okay, because I'm a man and I don't read your magazines. She goes, oh, okay, well, that's fine. I can understand. And when I said, my wife loves your magazines, she reads your magazines. My daughter reads your magazines, but not me. And so that was all very funny and jovial. And she says to me, well, we don't make the same product. And what I mean by that is obviously women, we sell primarily women's magazines. You men are easy to sell to. We just sell you football and cricket, right? But the women are more difficult to sell magazines to. So she said, football, cricket, and cars. They had magazines in all those segments. So we sell you men football, cricket, and cars, and you just buy them. We don't have to worry about you. But for the women, we have to be more creative. I said, well, tell me about that. I have no idea. Treat me like I'm an idiot. I have no idea. And he said, well, for the older women are really into things like the monarchy, for example. I said, sure, my mum reads your magazines, and every time one of the members of the royal family is on the cover, oh, she's off to the store to buy your magazine. Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen my mum do that. They went, yeah, that's what I mean. She says, yeah, that's what I mean. We put the Queen on the cover, or Charles and Diana, or Andrew and Fergie. We put some of the royals on the cover. But inside the content, what you need to understand is in the content of the magazine, we then do stories which are more aimed to older women. Yeah, we do some stories aimed for younger women, but we do most stories aimed for older women in the content, and then we put the advertising for older women next to that content. That's how the product works. I'm like, that makes complete sense to me. Like, I have my mom and my aunts, and they all read your magazines. And she's like, yeah. We do have, older women are a big segment of our market. We produce one magazine per week, but we have many different demographics in our customer base. So we have to cater to them. And then maybe the next week, we do a magazine for the younger women, right? I'm like, yeah. And back then, Tom Cruise was married to Nicole Kidman. So she said, on the younger woman's edition, the one targeting the younger women more, we might put someone like Tom and Nicole, okay? And the articles in the magazine will be more aimed at younger women, like the discussion of whether we should become a republic outside the Commonwealth. Okay, that discussion will be in that magazine. The discussion on whether we should become a republic won't be in the magazine with the royals on the front. You understand? I went, well, yeah, that makes complete sense. If you're putting a picture of the Queen on the front, you don't want the discussion about a republic in the magazine. Yeah, that makes complete sense to me, even though I'm just a man. And so we're having this conversation. And then she says, and then we put the advertising for younger women and what younger women need in the magazine intended for younger women. So, for example, the tampon companies advertise through us, and things about pregnancy and children and tampons and stuff like that we put in the magazine for the younger women because they're the women who have children. And I'm like, yeah, in fact, I've done a job for a company that manufactures tampons, and I actually strangely know something about that advertising area, at which they all laugh. I said, my wife uses their products, and so we're having a little bit of fun with it. And so she says, so you understand that what we do each week is we kind of change the title a little bit, change the cover, change the pictures on the cover, change the advertising for the magazine, and change the story in it, the contents and the stories in it, to suit segments. And we kind of rotate through these. And the net effect of all this is that we get a bigger audience. Because you understand we make no money on the magazine. The magazine itself, the cost of the magazine, is pretty much the cost of production. We make no money pretty much on the magazine. We make all our money, all our profit is made on the advertising that we put in the magazine. So circulation numbers are really important, and declining circulation hurts us much more through lost advertising revenue than lost copy revenue. And I didn't know that. I said, really? It's neutral. I said, maybe you run to a little bit of profit, but it's nothing like the advertising. Circulation is everything. Market share is everything because it lifts the advertising amounts and can lift them markedly. I'm like, huh. And she's saying the advertising amount, remember, if we sell 100 magazines versus 200 magazines, the advertising amount jumps substantially, but our costs don't jump at all. It costs no extra money to produce the content for 200 magazines and 100 magazines, right? It costs a little bit more in production and distribution, but only fractionally, because we're already producing and we're already distributing. You can add tens of thousands of magazines without adding very much cost, but the advertising revenue jumps. I'm like, huh, that's really interesting. No, I didn't know that. I didn't know that's how that worked. So anyhow, this happened in this discussion, like 2 or 3 hour discussion, and we just wrote notes down about all this. And so we build the data warehouse. Now we've got the data warehouse, right? And we're back to this discussion about, does what's on the cover make any difference? Because what was happening in the magazine business, and this happens in a lot of businesses, is they were distributing for their major title, they were distributing 300,000 copies a week, and there were 7,000 outlets. So the question is, of the 300,000 copies, how many do we send to each of the 7,000 outlets? Because obviously some outlets sell more copies than others. And that's called the draw. How many copies do you draw from the batch to send to each outlet? And their results were bad. I mean, the results were they were wasting 25% of copies went unsold. But the problem was some outlets would sell out and some outlets would be left with lots of copies, and their calculations for the draw seemed to me to be bad. And when I talked with them about that, they said, no, 25% is kind of the industry standard. And these sellouts and oversupplies, these numbers are standard. There's nothing much we can do about this. We've talked to the vendor of our ERP system that calculates these things, and they tell us this is what all their customers do and it's standard. And I went, well, I don't really think that should be standard. These numbers seem high to me. And so we were in this discussion, and the IT guys are defending this and saying, well, this is normal. There's nothing to be done about this. And I said, well, okay. You say it's normal, there's nothing to be done about this, but I'd like to look into this. And I want to go talk to some of the editors about which magazines to compare, because I think that what's on the cover is going to have an effect with how many copies are bought because of where they're bought. And they're like, well, no, the ERP can't do that. I said, no, it can't do it, but we can do it. We can figure this out. And this is one of my ideas, because the woman had told me we make different products each week. I figured, let's look into that. It can't hurt. I mean, the company's on the skids. It can't hurt, right? So I went up to see the senior editor, and I reminded her of the conversation that she was at. And I said, what I'd like from you, because we're going to investigate this. This is an investigation. So what I'd like from you is, could you please talk to your people and give me like half a dozen examples of different magazines where you would consider them in the same group. So 6 different groups with 6 different magazines in those 6 different groups, and we'll go analyze them and see if the sales figures vary by location. She says, oh, I don't need to talk to my people about that. I'm the senior editor. Just I'll put it in a spreadsheet and send it to you within the hour. I'm like, really? Great. So she did. She sent me this list of all these groups of magazines that I could look into. And we sat down. We spent a couple of days trying to look at the sales and draw and the sellouts and oversupplies of these groups. And lo and behold, what do you think we found? Lo and behold, what we found was the magazines pitched at different target groups had different levels of sales in different outlets, but the levels of sales at the different outlets were relatively consistent for the magazines in the same group. So let me put this another way. The young women typically bought their magazines on their commute to the office or at the office, right? Because the young women, many more of the young women worked than the older women, right? The older women tended to buy their magazines at supermarkets or where they shopped, at stores where they shopped, okay? Because the magazine went on sale Monday morning. So the older women, they would wait until they were doing their shopping to buy the magazine. The younger women would tend to buy their magazine near their place of business rather than where they shopped or near their home. And so the sales pattern for magazines was dramatically different depending on who the target audience was for that magazine for that week. And it was substantially different by the age target of the women because of the younger women being more predominantly in the workforce or at university or places like that, right? So we went through all this and we found this, and we're sitting down with the editors and we're like, yeah, there's definitely correlations between, after this is like a week later, there's definitely correlations between the targets that you're aiming at and the number of sales affecting your sellouts and your oversupplies. There's absolutely correlation here. We need to do more analytics on this to get our numbers to be better. Okay, we found that there is a correlation. Now we need to dig down deep. And so we got all these lists of all this history. We had 10 years of history, got all these lists of all this history, and we did all these analytics. And by now I was leaving. This is January 2001. I was getting ready to leave Australia, and I was handing all this stuff over, right? And that's kind of where my involvement ended, while we were still in the deep dive of figuring out, do these things really show us this? Okay, so that was the end of my involvement, but obviously I sold the deal and built the data warehouse, right? Well, over time, as I started doing, as the guys that I left there started doing more analytics, they became more and more confident that they could predict the future sales based on these new algorithms that we had tied to magazine covers and content. So obviously this is a big thing. The ERP had been there for years. The ERP was what decided how many copies went where. To move away from the ERP rules to our own in-house rules, that was a big deal, and there was a lot of discussion about that, etc. So they decided to have some tests and do some testing on this, and that was great. After a while, they tested on all this, figured out that they were doing better with the forecasting that we were doing than the forecasting that ERP was doing, and the ERP was supposed to be world class at forecasting draw, right? Because they had over 100 customers worldwide. So anyhow, all that went through, and they said, okay, great, let's move over. The guys built an application where the editors, when they were constructing the issue, would go and pick 12 copies, 12, 15, something like that, of other issues which were similar. And they just click them and we get the list of the issues that were similar. And we would calculate this issue's draw, the number of copies to send to each outlet, based on the profile of those 12 issues, not based on the profile of all issues, right? Now, as I said, I was gone, and I'd left a buddy there in charge of doing all this stuff, and he was sending me emails saying it's getting better and better and better. Each month, the results are getting better and better. Okay? So fast forward to 2003. This is like 2 years later. Early 2003, after 2000, or 3 years later, what does Kerry Packer do? He stands up and he says, ACP is the jewel in the corporate crown, best performing company in the corporate crown. And John Alexander was promoted, and eventually John went right to the top of the Packer group. John was a superstar after this turnaround. So ACP, according to the owner, the richest man in the country, was a dog with fleas, firing the managing director, piece of junk, going badly, and I'm the richest man in the country, I can hire anyone I want. A couple of years later, ACP is a jewel in the corporate crown. They turned around so swiftly that they went from the day I arrived, they had 37% market share. 2 years later, they were at 42% market share. They doubled their gross profit because that was all, the extra 5% in market share was all extra advertising revenue, which paid for everything. Their costs had not gone up that much, just a bit more print, bit more paper was all their costs had gone up. No extra people needed to produce the content, but they went from 37% to 42%, doubled their gross profit, lifted their advertising revenue, and Kerry Packer called it the jewel in the corporate crown. And after Kerry Packer passed away as a relatively old man who had a good life, James sold ACP to the Bauer Group, which is a large German publisher, and it was rated one of the 10 best publishing companies in the world when it was sold to Bauer Group. All because little old me didn't take no for an answer 4 times. I lost the deal the first 3 times and finally got it the 4th time, even having to wrestle it off the buddies of the chairman of the Conservative political party. And the key thing that we found was what's on the cover is related to who buys the copy where, right? And the product was not the same product each time over. The product was actually changing each week. How about that? How about that? So that was my role. That's my little story about how did I help the richest man in the country to do one of the biggest corporate turnarounds ever in the country. Because like ACP was on life support. It was when you sit in front of the managing director, the new managing director, and he says, "I hope you got something, Pete, because we got nothing." When you walk into a company and that's the message from the managing director, "I hope you got something because I got nothing, we got nothing," you know that company's in real trouble, right? You know it's in real trouble. And really, it was only the one idea. That wasn't my idea, it was given to me. The idea was, we don't make the same product each week. We make a different product each week, and we should treat it as a different product each week. And in investigation, we found that related to sales. It was causing their sellouts and oversupplies. And we fixed that forecasting process, and that was the key change, the biggest single change. Now, of course, we did other things. There was lots of other things we did, including we invested in having a replenishment depot in Sydney and Melbourne. So everybody knows in Australia the 2 big cities are Sydney and Melbourne. We put in a replenishment depot in the city, and we did an extra drop of magazines on Wednesday nights based on the sales for the first couple of days of the week. Another thing that we did was have electronic feedback of sales. So we did, because this is 2000, it wasn't common for stores to be able to give us back feedback of their sales. So we put equipment into stores where we could get feedback of sales overnight. So the store would do their sales during the day. We get feedback overnight. The feedback from Monday and Tuesday nights Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday nights was used to schedule the drops on Thursday to improve our sellout oversupply ratios. And the sellout oversupplies, we almost eliminated sellouts oversupplies. They were almost eliminated. It went from this is normal to have these rates of sellouts oversupplies to it's unusual to have an oversupply or a sellout now at any of our 7,000 outlets. Unusual. So something that was accepted as normal was completely transformed to be something unusual, and it had a huge effect. Now most of the copies were being sold, so they didn't take their price down. They were making a little bit more money out of their copies. Previously, 25% of their copies were being destroyed, or not sold, and we got that down to 12%. So they actually got some profitability out of the copies. But more importantly, when somebody went into a store to buy their magazine, it was there. Okay, the magazine was there to buy because the rate of sellout was so high. By Thursday and Fridays, in Australia, in case you don't know, we have Thursday night shopping. So Thursday night is also a big bump for when these women's magazines get sold, because a lot of women put off buying their magazine until they do their Thursday night shopping, right? And if the magazine's not there on their Thursday night shopping, then they will buy the competitive magazines. So in our new drops, we ship the new drops of magazines on the Thursday in preparation for the Thursday night shopping, based on the sales from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And that really helped get rid of sellouts and oversupplies. So that was my part in helping Kerry Packer and his colleagues turn the biggest publishing house in Australia, the biggest magazine publishing house in Australia, turn it around in one of the biggest corporate comebacks of all time. That was my little bit. Okay? And that turned out to be useful because some years later in 2006, I was working at Electronic Arts, and of course they were distributing computer games by DVD in 2006, and they had exactly the same problems. Although with computer games, the revenue degradation for the game is very rapid. You know, the game comes out at €69.99 or $69.99 in the US. You know, a month later it's $59.99, a month later it's $49.99, and a month later it's in the three for two bin, right? Or 2 for 1 bin. So the degradation curve of the computer game from Electronic Arts, of the retail price, goes down quite quickly. It's like month to month to month. So you want to sell as many copies as you can in the first 1 to 2 months, and you don't want to run out. You don't want predominantly men buy these computer games, so you don't want men walking into a store with their hard-earned €69.99 and saying, and the game not being there, right? Because that's going to make them not very happy. Okay, so we applied some of the similar things to Electronic Arts, but the work that I proposed at Electronic Arts never went into production, and so they weren't able to do the same thing. But we were having internal arguments about, I've done this before at the biggest publisher in Australia. I know what I'm doing. This is what you should be doing. I didn't win that argument at Electronic Arts, and the results speak for themselves. The results in 2007 were terrible. So anyhow, that's my story about that. I hope you enjoyed the story. That's my story about how I helped the richest man in the country do one of the most remarkable corporate turnarounds in the country, making a magazine publishing business much more profitable as the era of the internet came in. Okay? You got to remember, this was the era of the internet coming in, and we still managed to make that magazine business turn around. Okay? So I thought you'd like that story. Obviously, that's not the last company I helped turn around in terms of magazine business, right? Or in terms of analytics, which helps customers. It's obviously not the last thing that I did. I can now talk about it because it's 17, 18 years ago. I can talk about it now. But it's obviously not the last thing I did. And obviously, I've had a lot of time and experience looking at company data, trying to figure out what could be done to help this company be more profitable. Okay? I tell these stories as a little bit of credibility. Yeah? So if you want me to help you with your company and help you make your company more profitable, I'd be interested in hearing from you. If I can help you, of course, I'll say yes, and we'll look into things. If after looking into things, I know or I feel that I really can't help you, I will tell you, and I won't take your money. Okay? I will say, having done these preliminary investigations, I'm not your guy. Maybe I can point you to somebody who is your guy, but me personally, I'm not your guy. I will do that, and I'm quite famous for doing that in many jobs in Australia and around the world. Okay? So if I can help, I'd love to help. If I can't help, I will tell you. And this is just another story to give you some background about, yes, I do know what I'm doing with respect to, say, publishing. By the way, I also did the data model for Sybase for publishers in a job in the US for a newspaper in 2001, 2002, and our data models have a subscription publishing component data model. We also do store sales publishing, but not that many magazines and newspapers are sold through stores in the West anymore. Some are sold through subscriptions, but the big change, of course, has been newspapers are selling online subscriptions now. And so the data model has more evolved to cater for the online subscription model rather than the store sales model. Okay? So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and bye for now.